She looked at me the way people look at someone they recognize, but can't quite place a long, searching stare from across the produce aisle. Her cart stopped in the middle of the floor, her hand resting on a bag of apples she'd forgotten she was holding. I noticed her because she was blocking the path I needed to take with my cart of restocking items, and when I said, "Excuse me," she didn't move. She just kept looking at my face with an expression I didn't know how to read. Not threatening, not confused, something closer to grief. "I'm sorry," she finally said, stepping aside. "You just look so much like someone I used to know." I told her not to worry about it and pushed my cart past her toward the bread section. That was a Thursday in early November, 2 weeks after I'd started working the overnight stocking shift at Mercer's Food and Drug on Route 9 outside of Clarksburg, West Virginia. I was 67 years old, and I was grateful for the job. I want to explain how I got there, because the beginning matters if you want to understand the end. My wife, Patricia, died on a Saturday in April. We had been married 41 years. She was the kind of woman who remembered everybody's birthday, who kept a handwritten address book because she didn't trust computers with the names of people she loved, who made soup from scratch when anyone in the neighborhood was sick. The house we lived in, a 3-bedroom on Carpenter Street in Bridgeport, had been hers before it was ours. Her parents had built it. We raised our 2 children there, my son, Dennis, and my daughter, Carol. When Patricia died, I was not prepared for what came after. The grief was the first thing, of course. That's the part people expect. What I didn't expect was how quickly the people I had trusted most in the world would show me who they really were when there was no one left to keep the peace. Dennis called me 6 weeks after the funeral. He said he and his wife had been talking, and they were worried about me living alone in such a big house. He said it made more sense, financially and practically, for them to move in and help manage the property. He said I could stay in the guest room and he would take care of everything. He made it sound like kindness. I was still raw from losing Patricia, still sleeping on her side of the bed because I couldn't bear to rearrange anything, and so I said yes. I said yes because I was tired and sad, and I trusted my son. Within 3 months, the locks had been changed. Not all at once. First, it was just the back door, and Dennis said the old lock was broken. Then the front door, and he said it was a security upgrade. Then he sat me down one evening and slid a piece of paper across the kitchen table, and he explained that for tax purposes, it would be better if the property was formally in his name. He had a pen ready. His wife sat at the counter drinking tea and said nothing. I did not sign the paper. What happened after that I don't like to think about for too long. There was a conversation that became an argument, that became something I had no word for except the feeling of a door closing on everything I had believed about my family. Dennis told me I was being paranoid. His wife told me I was ungrateful. They told me I couldn't keep living there if I was going to be difficult. And when I asked what that meant, Dennis said I had 2 weeks to find somewhere else to stay. I was 67 years old. My wife had been dead for 4 months. And my son was telling me to leave the house that Patricia's parents had built with their own hands. My daughter, Carol, lived in Phoenix. When I called her, she listened quietly for a long time. Then she told me that Dennis had already called her, and that she thought maybe a fresh start would be good for me, and that I should think about an assisted living situation. I said I didn't need assisted living. I needed my family to stop treating me like a problem to be managed. She said she understood, but her voice said that she didn't, or that she did and had decided it wasn't her business to get involved. We hung up, and I sat in my car in a gas station parking lot for 45 minutes before I could drive. I ended up renting a room from a woman named Mrs. Petrakis on the north side of Clarksburg. She was 78 and nearly deaf and didn't ask questions, which suited me fine. I paid rent by doing small repairs around the house and supplementing with my Social Security, which wasn't much. That's how I ended up at the overnight job at Mercer's. Not because I needed to stay busy, because I needed to eat and keep the lights on and not ask my son or daughter for a single thing. I want you to understand something about my father before I go any further, because none of what happened to me later makes sense without him. My father's name was Harold Whitmore. He was a maintenance worker at Garrison Elementary School in Clarksburg for 31 years. He started when I was 4 and retired when I was 35, And in all that time, I never heard a single person say a bad word about him. Not one. The teachers called him Harold and asked about his garden. The principal kept a photo of him on the wall with the long-term staff. The kids and I was one of them. Once knew him as the man who fixed things and never made you feel stupid for breaking them. He was not a man of money. He drove the same truck for 19 years. He wore the same jacket every winter until the zipper gave out. When my mother needed dental work they couldn't afford, he picked up weekend shifts at a lumber yard for 8 months and never mentioned it to anyone until my mother let it slip at Christmas, and even then he changed the subject. He died at 79. Heart failure, 2 years before Patricia died. I held his hand in the hospital and told him he was the best man I had ever known. And I meant it the way you only mean things when you know you won't have another chance to say them. He never told me about Dorothy. The second time the woman with the apples saw me was a Monday, around 1 in the morning when the store was almost empty. I was working the cereal aisle, and she came around the corner and stopped again, the same way she had before. This time she didn't pretend she wasn't staring. "Excuse me," she said. "I know this is going to sound very strange, but is your last name Whitmore?" I set down the box I was holding and looked at her. She was in her late 70s, maybe 80, with white hair cut short and a wool coat that looked expensive but old. She had a cane, but she wasn't leaning on it. She was standing up very straight, like the question had cost her something, and she wanted to make sure she was ready for the answer. I told her yes. Yes, my last name was Whitmore. She put her free hand over her mouth. Her eyes went wet almost immediately, the way eyes do when someone has been holding something back for a very long time and finally gets to let it go. "Your father," she said, "Harold Whitmore. Was he your father?" I stared at her. The store hummed around us, the fluorescent lights doing what fluorescent lights do at 1 in the morning. I said yes, Harold Whitmore had been my father. He had passed away several years ago. She closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, she looked steadier. "I've been looking for your family for 22 years, she said. "I found your name in a local directory and I didn't know if it was really you. So I've been coming in here hoping to see if you looked like him." She paused. "You look exactly like him." Her name was Dorothy Calloway. She asked if we could sit down somewhere, and the store manager, a good-natured man named Phil who knew about my situation and cut me more slack than I deserved, let us use the break room. Dorothy and I sat across from each other at a folding table with bad coffee between us, and she told me a story that I had never heard, about a woman I had never met, and a father I thought I already knew everything about. In the winter of 1973, Dorothy was 17 years old. She had run away from her home in Morgantown after a situation she described carefully, in the way people describe things that hurt to look at directly. Her father drank. Her stepmother had made clear that Dorothy's presence in the house was a problem she hadn't signed up for. Dorothy had been passed between relatives for 2 years, and finally decided she was better off on her own, which is the kind of decision that 17-year-olds make when no adult in their life has ever given them reason to think otherwise. She made it to Clarksburg on a Greyhound with $34 and a bag with 2 changes of clothes. It was February. She found an unlocked window in the basement of Garrison Elementary School and spent 3 nights sleeping on a pile of gymnasium mats she'd pulled from a storage closet. She was hungry and cold, and convinced that no one was going to help her because no one had yet. On the 4th morning, my father found her. She told me she was ready for him to call the police. She told me she braced herself for the particular kind of dismissal that she'd come to expect from adults, the way they looked through her rather than at her, the way they made decisions about her life without speaking to her like she was a person. She was ready for all of that. Instead, my father sat down on the floor next to her. He didn't ask what she was doing there. He said he was going to get breakfast from the cafeteria before school started, and did she want anything? He brought her scrambled eggs and toast on a paper plate and a carton of orange juice, and he sat with her while she ate, and he didn't say a word about her situation until she finished. Then he asked her, quietly, if she was safe. Not "How did you get here?" or "Where are your parents?" or "You can't stay here." He asked her if she was safe. Dorothy told me she started crying so hard she couldn't speak for several minutes, because she realized that no one had ever asked her that before. Not once in 17 years had any adult looked at her and asked whether she was safe. My father listened to her story over the next hour. He didn't offer opinions about her father or her stepmother. He didn't tell her what she should have done or what she needed to do next. He said she could stay in the basement for a little while longer, and he would bring her food in the mornings before staff arrived, and they would figure out the rest together. She stayed for 6 weeks. My father brought her food every morning. He found her a better sleeping arrangement, a cot from the nurse's office that he stored in a utility closet, with blankets from the lost and found that had been there long enough that no one was coming back for them. He brought her books from the school library, slipping them back before they were missed. He found out she was good at math and brought her old workbooks, and they talked through problems together during his lunch break. He never told anyone she was there. After 6 weeks, he had worked out an arrangement with a woman from his church, a widow named Mrs. Haynes, who took in boarders and had a spare room and didn't have children of her own. My father paid the first 2 months of Dorothy's rent out of his own pocket. He told Dorothy it was a loan, not a gift, because he said she seemed like someone who would keep her word better if there was a promise attached. And he was right. He helped her enroll in night classes to finish her GED. He wrote her a reference letter for a job at a local diner. He checked in on her for 2 years, until she had saved enough money to move to Pittsburgh for a hospitality management program at the community college. The day she left, she went to the school to say goodbye. My father gave her an envelope with $40 in it, his own money, and told her she was going to be just fine. She tried to refuse the money. He told her it wasn't charity, it was a head start, and there was a difference. Dorothy told me she had paid that $40 back in her mind every single day for 50 years. She said she never stopped thinking about my father, never stopped telling the story of what he did to anyone who would listen, never stopped looking for a way to find him and thank him properly. She'd built her life in Pittsburgh. She married a man named Robert Calloway who was, by her account, a patient and decent person who understood that she needed to do something meaningful with what she'd survived. Together, they started a small catering company in 1988, 2 folding tables and a rented kitchen, and Dorothy's talent for making food that made people feel like someone cared about them. Over 20 years, that company became Calloway Event Services, with contracts across western Pennsylvania and northern West Virginia, accounts with hospitals and universities and corporate clients, more than 60 employees, and a reputation that Dorothy was genuinely proud of. Robert passed away in 2009. Dorothy kept running the company. She had no children. When she retired in 2018, she handed the operations to a management team but retained her ownership stake. She had spent years trying to find my father. She hired a researcher in 2001 who traced him to Clarksburg but lost the trail. She found references to a Harold Whitmore in local records but couldn't confirm it was him until she found an old school district newsletter from 1987 with a photo and his name. By then, she'd learned he was gone. She found me through a combination of that newsletter, a local White Pages listing, and the particular way I apparently have my father's jaw. I sat in that break room for a long time after she finished talking. I didn't know what to say. I kept thinking about the winter of 1973. I was 10 years old. I would have been in the 4th grade, and my father was waking up early every morning to bring food to a girl hiding in the basement of my school. And he never said a word about it to anyone, not even to my mother, not to me, not in 31 years of retirement and family dinners and birthdays and the long, quiet conversations we had on his front porch in the years before he died. He carried it like he carried everything he did for people, silently, without expectation, like it was simply the only reasonable thing to do, and therefore didn't require acknowledgement. I told Dorothy thank you for telling me. I told her it didn't surprise me, because he had been that kind of man. She looked at me across the table and then she asked if she could come back the next evening, because she had something else she wanted to discuss. I said yes. She came back on a Tuesday, this time with a folder. She sat down and she folded her hands on top of it, and she looked at me with the same directness she'd had the night before. She told me she had thought for a long time about what she owed my father and by extension his family. She said she was not a sentimental woman, and she was not doing this to make herself feel better. She said her company was now valued at something close to $4 million, and she had no children to leave it to. And she had created a legal structure years ago specifically for this possibility, the possibility that she would one day find Harold Whitmore's family. She slid the folder across the table. She was offering me a 30% ownership stake in Callaway Event Services to be transferred immediately, with quarterly distributions from company profits, based on the previous year's earnings, that came to somewhere in the range of $80,000 annually. She also had a check made out to me for $200,000, what she calculated, accounting for decades of interest, as the value of everything my father had given her, plus the 2 months of rent he'd paid for her at Mrs. Haynes's house. I looked at the papers in the folder for a long time without touching them. Then I told her I needed to think about it. She said she understood. She left her number and told me the offer had no expiration. I drove home to Mrs. Petrakis's house at 6 in the morning after my shift ended, and I sat in my car in the driveway, and I thought about my father. I thought about him sitting on a cold basement floor, handing a scared teenager a paper plate of scrambled eggs. I thought about him walking to his truck in the February cold with bread he'd paid for himself, before anyone else was awake. I thought about him standing in the parking lot of that school, pressing an envelope into a young woman's hand and calling it a head start. He had never told me. Not because he was ashamed of it. My father wasn't ashamed of kindness. He had never told me because it hadn't occurred to him that it was something worth telling. He had done what needed to be done, and then he had gone home and eaten dinner and helped me with my homework and watched the news and gone to bed. That was how he operated. The help was the point. The recognition was irrelevant. I went inside, and I lay down on my small bed in my small rented room, and I cried. I cried for my father, and for Dorothy, and for the girl she had been, and for the man he had been, and for the fact that they had never gotten to see each other again. I cried because I missed him, and because I was proud of him, and because I was alone in a rented room at 67 years old, and my wife was dead, and my son had told me to leave, and finding out that your father was a genuinely good man doesn't fix those things, but it changes how they feel. I called Dorothy 2 days later. I told her I was going to accept, but I wanted to do something with it that I needed to explain to her. She said she was listening. I said I wanted to use a portion of the money to establish a scholarship fund at Garrison Elementary, or whatever had replaced it, because the original building had been torn down years ago in my father's name. Something for students from difficult home situations. Something that looked at a kid and asked if they were safe before it asked anything else. Dorothy was quiet on the line for a moment, and then she said that was exactly the kind of thing she'd hoped would happen. She said my father would have been embarrassed by it, and that was how you knew it was right. We worked with her attorneys over the following weeks. I gave notice at Mercer's. Phil shook my hand and told me he'd always known something was different about me, which was a kind thing to say. I signed the paperwork. I opened a bank account that had more money in it than I had ever seen in my life, and I felt, for the first time since April, like I could breathe. I have to tell you about Dennis. He called 2 weeks after the papers were signed. I don't know how he found out small towns talk, and someone must have seen something or overheard something or made a connection somewhere. He called on a Sunday evening, and his voice was the same voice he used when he wanted something. I recognized it the way you recognize weather. He said he had been thinking about me. He said he was worried about how I was doing, living in someone's spare room at my age. He said he and his wife had been talking and they felt terrible about how things had ended between us, and that if I wanted to come back, there was always room. He said family was family. I listened to all of this without speaking. Then he said he'd heard I had come into some money. He said it carefully, like the sentence was made of something fragile. He said that obviously whatever I had inherited or received was my business, but that given the circumstances, given the fact that Patricia's family had built that house, given the history of everything, it seemed like the right thing to do would be to have a conversation about how the family as a whole might benefit. He used the phrase, moving forward together, twice. I told him I appreciated the call. He waited. I told him that I wanted to tell him something about his grandfather, my father, Harold Whitmore. And I told him the whole story, every detail. Dorothy's cold February, the scrambled eggs, the cot, the books, the $40, the 50 years. I told it slowly and completely, the way my father would never have told it himself. Dennis was quiet for a moment when I finished. Then he said that was a beautiful story, and that it showed there was clearly a tradition of generosity in our family, and that he hoped I would honor that tradition. I understood then, fully and without any remaining doubt, exactly who my son was. I told him that I agreed there was a tradition of generosity in our family. I told him that my father had spent his whole life giving to people who had nothing, without ever expecting a single thing in return. I told him that I intended to honor that tradition, and that the Harold Whitmore Scholarship Fund at the new Garrison Learning Center would be one way I planned to do that, and that a donation to a women's transitional housing program in Clarksburg would be another, and that a fully funded education account for the child of one of the young women at that program who reminded Dorothy of herself would be a third. I told him that I had not included him in any of these plans, and that I felt completely at peace with that decision. He said my name once, the way he used to say it when he was trying to pull rank as the younger generation, explaining something to the older one. I let the silence sit after it. Then I said goodbye, and I ended the call. Carol called 3 days later. I let it go to voicemail. She left a message saying she'd heard what happened and she hoped I was well and that she'd always cared about me. And I believed the last part, somewhat in the way you believe things that are true but insufficient. I didn't call back that week. I needed some time to decide what kind of relationship, if any, I wanted to have with someone who had told me that being pushed out of my home by my son might be good for me. Maybe I'll call her eventually. Maybe things will change. I'm not sure I'm the right person to decide that yet, and I've made my peace with not knowing. What I know is this. I am living now in a small apartment in Clarksburg that I rent month to month while I decide what to do with the rest of my life. It's got a good kitchen and a window that looks out over a courtyard where 2 oak trees are doing what oak trees do, which is stand there and be solid and expect nothing from anyone. I cook dinner in the evenings. I read more than I have in years. I go to the Garrison Learning Center, which is what they call the new building on the site of the old school, 2 mornings a week, to help coordinate the scholarship committee that Dorothy and I set up together. Dorothy and I have lunch together every few weeks. She tells me more stories about my father as she remembers them. Small things she held on to for 50 years. The way he pronounced February wrong his whole life, and didn't care when she pointed it out. The book on wildflowers he once brought her that had his name written in the cover. The time he fixed a broken window latch in the basement without being asked so it wouldn't be cold. Little things. The kind of details you can only keep for decades if you're really paying attention. If the person mattered to you in a way that doesn't diminish over time. I think about the girl she was in 1973, hiding behind a stack of gymnasium mats with $34, ready to be invisible to another adult who'd decided she didn't matter. And I think about my father, in his work clothes at 6 in the morning, finding her there and sitting down on the floor because standing over her seemed like the wrong choice. He made the right choice. He always made the right choice. He just never made a show of it. I set up the scholarship in his name, and I asked Dorothy if she would be the one to present the first award, because she was the most qualified person I had ever met to look at a child from a hard situation and say, "You're going to be fine." She said she would be honored. She said my father would be embarrassed. I told her that was the idea. There is a framed photograph of him on the wall of the scholarship office. It's from 1979, taken by a student who was doing a photography project. Someone sent it to the school district, and they kept it in their files for years, and one of Dorothy's researchers found it. He's standing in the hallway next to a mop he's leaning on with both hands, and he's laughing at something just off camera. He has no idea the picture is being taken. That's the part I love the most about it. He's not performing for anyone. He's just Harold Whitmore, standing in a school hallway, laughing. I look at that photograph when I go in on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, and I think about what it means to leave something behind. Not money, not property, not the kind of thing you can fight over around a kitchen table with a pen ready and a glass of tea gone cold. The real thing. The thing that lasts. A girl in a cold basement, eating scrambled eggs off a paper plate, hearing for the first time in her life that someone wanted to know if she was safe. Carrying that with her for 50 years, building a life out of it, coming back. That's the legacy. That's the only one that ever mattered. A few weeks after the scholarship committee had its first meeting, I was walking out of the learning center, and I passed a boy sitting alone on a bench outside the front entrance. He looked about 12, backpack at his feet, staring at nothing with the specific expression of someone who has learned not to look like they need anything. I recognized it. I'd seen it in an old photograph of Dorothy. I sat down on the other end of the bench, not close, just present. He didn't look at me. I didn't say anything for a minute. Then I asked him if he was doing okay. Not where are your parents or why are you still here? Just, are you doing okay? He shrugged. Then he looked at me sideways, the way kids look at adults when they're calculating whether the adult is going to be useful or just another version of the problem. I told him I used to go to school in a building that stood right where we were sitting a long time ago. I told him my father had worked here for 31 years. I asked him if he knew about the new scholarship program with the man's name on the wall inside. He said he'd heard of it, but he didn't know anything about it. I told him the short version. I told him that a long time ago, a man who worked in this building had helped a young woman who needed it, quietly and without asking for anything, and that the young woman had remembered for 50 years and come back to say thank you in the only way she knew how. I told him that some things you do for people stay with them longer than you realize. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked what the man's name was. I told him, Harold Whitmore. He nodded slowly, like he was filing it away. I left him sitting there and walked to my car in the November cold. I didn't look back. My father wouldn't have, and it seemed right to do things the way he would have done them, make the gesture, leave it where it lands, trust that it's enough. It is enough. More than enough. And if you're listening to this and you've ever been in that basement, cold and hungry and ready to be invisible, I want you to know that there are still people who will sit down on the floor next to you. They don't make the news. They don't post about it. They just show up and they ask if you're safe, and they mean it. My father was one of them. I'm trying, in whatever years I have left, to be one of them too. Did this story mean anything to you? I'd love to hear from you. What city or state are you watching from today? Let me know in the comments below.